Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна, і зі мною незмінна партнерка, ведуча, авторка
Наталка Гуменюк. Привіт всім.
Привіт, Наталко. Наталка у нас повертається ще з кількох дуже плідних поїздок, одна з яких потрапила в такий цікавий час. Насправді, ми постійно живемо в цікавому часі, але надзвичайно цікаво було поговорити про те, що відбувається в США у США з людьми, які дуже добре розуміються на контексті, в нюансах. І сьогоднішня наша розмова – це розмова Наталки, інтерв'ю Наталки з американським редактором, видавцем, аналітиком Даміром Марусичем. Наталко, розкажи, будь ласка, в який момент ти його застала, тому що вже навіть, по-моєму, з того часу ще кілька витків всього відбулося. Про що ви з ним говорили?
Я поясню також, Дамір є засновником подкасту «Народні мудрості», так можна сказати, про великі ідеї. Він є редактором The Washington Post в рубрики «Опінії», зокрема, які стосуються і американської політики, але й міжнародних відносин. Загалом він спеціалізувався і спеціалізується на таких питаннях, як американська зовнішня політика, поляризація американської політики всередині, європейські справи. Дамір має хорватське походження, хоча там зростав і формувався в Сполучених Штатах, і багато років займався, співпрацюючи в різних аналітичних центрах, Балканами і Росією. Окрім того, Дамір був виконавчим редактором видання The American Interest. Це такий журнал про зовнішню політику, який довго існував, який був заснований Френсісом Фукуямою після того, як Френсіс залишив журнал «Національний інтерес», в якому була опублікована ця величезна стаття, відома стаття про кінець історії. Це таке середовище на той час, скажімо, консерваторів-трансатлантистів, але які, звісно, зараз, якщо ми говоримо про останні 10 років від початку присутності Дональда Трампа в американській політиці, так, скажімо, є критичними до політики Трампа швидше, але залишаються швидше консервативними, але трансатлантистами, особливо зважаючи на свої якісь зв'язки, розуміння нашого регіону і Балкан. Але чому мені дуже цікаво було поговорити саме з Даміром? Це не секрет, що більшість людей, з якими ми спілкуємося в нашому колі, вони аналітики, мислителі, політологи, журналісти-американці надзвичайно критичні до Дональда Трампа, бо є ясна причина. Загалом мало би було мати в нашому середовищі людей, які, скажімо так, співчувають авторитарним якимось зазіханням і тому подібному. Але що цікаво, з Даміром ми багато говорили про Сполучені Штати під час останньої президентської кампанії. Після цього чимало, після того, як тільки там що відбулося, аналізували, але якщо ви є слухачами нашого подкасту, можливо, помітили, що останні, напевно, 3 місяці в нас не було випусків саме з американцями. Ми говорили з європейцями, ми говорили про дуже багато речей, і я, власне, дочекалася цієї поїздки до Америки, яка в мене була, до Нью-Йорка і Вашингтона, щоб, скажімо, на власні очі побачити і підтвердити, скажімо, або не підтвердити, наскільки там депресивний Вашингтон, наскільки там, умовно, демократи зализують рани, чи вже якось рухаються і щось роблять, наскільки вашингтонський істеблішмент і, скажімо, там ті люди, які в цій столиці Сполучених Штатів роками жили, коли ти не живеш в Сполучених Штатах, там зараз є відчуття, що там якогось там повного декадансу, катастрофи, депресії, якогось неприйняття. Чим для мене також особливий Дамір як голос, і я саме з нього хотіла би почати якесь повернення до розбору американської зовнішньої політики і внутрішньої політики. Саме з Даміра він завжди допомагав мені в різні часи якось мати стосунок до різних середовищ. І це була вже навіть не перший випадок, але, скажімо, під час висвітлення мого президентських перегонів восени, наприклад, Дамір в своєму домі, там є дуже велика практика в Вашингтоні збирати людей там різних поглядів на якісь там умовно там вечірки обговорення. Він прям спеціально збирав людей, які якось там щось знають про Україну, але не тільки, які були там демократами, арабами, демократами такими-то, республіканцями, які симпатизують Трампу, республіканцями, які не симпатизують Трампу. Тобто з журналістами і якимись розумними людьми, які мають оцю поліфонію думок, але в рамках якоїсь адекватності. Да? Це там не мага, а, умовно кажучи, люди, які можуть там пояснювати. А от Трамп вам джавеліни давав, а от з Камала така-то, і навпаки, там з людьми дуже критичними, дуже багато людей його середовища тоді навіть на цій, скажімо так, вечірці, яка тоді була в мене в Вашингтоні, це була допомога мені, багато мене орієнтували там, чому треба їхати до арабської спільноти в Дірборн, чому треба їхати там в Пенсильванію, чи на які речі треба звертати увагу. І, власне, я повернулася, і я думаю, що нас частенько можуть навіть не звинувачити, але є така прихильність сказати, от ви спілкуєтесь з демократами, ви спілкуєтеся з жорсткими критиками Трампа, які там зараз кажуть апокаліпсис, катастрофа і все таке інше, чи є інші думки. Звісно, в нас така специфіка подкасту, коли все має значення, ми все-таки спілкуємося з людьми, кому ми довіряємо.
Слухай, вибач, але є речі, які дійсно, у нас немає зобов'язання шукати баланс в речах, які є об'єктивно дуже поганими. Я розумію, про що ти говориш, тут, типу, політичний спектр американський, але, тебе важко запідозрити в цьому, принаймні мені, з твоєї роботи.
Слухай, буде можливість поговорити з кимось цікавим з МАГА, поговоримо. В цьому випадку, після певної паузи, я хотіла побачити людину, в нас будуть інші подкасти з такими там явними критиками Трампа і такими. Власне, мої питання до Даміра були речі до людини, скажімо, поміркованої, людини, яка прям заточена на те, щоб постійно дивитися на різні голоси. Він пише про поляризацію. Це тема, якою він цікавиться, зокрема, причини її. Я пояснила, що він все-таки частково з оцього середовища там трансатлантистів, консерваторів, хоча там ліберальний, але в нього є оцей природній талант спілкуватися і бачити широке коло людей, які можуть бути цікавими. Цікаві голоси, і саме тому я хочу ці пояснення почати з нього. Ми говорили, звісно, насамперед, знову ж таки кажу, я просила його пояснити, наскільки є прийняття Дональда Трампа Америкою великою, естеблішментом, елітами, аналітиками, певні зміни, які відбуваються, мовно кажучи, унормування всього того, що відбулося після інавгурації Дональда Трампа. Трошки його кабінет, як сприймають кого, як поводяться демократи, який є горизонт осяжності. Тому що, я тобі там відповім і собі, і, напевно, багатьом людям дуже цікаво, коли я була цього разу в Сполучених Штатах, європейські друзі, аналітики різні, вони писали так, як я зазвичай десь буваю в якихось територіях конфліктних, умовно кажуть, от ти там їдеш в Сирії, всі тобі там, як там, що там, воно там ще горить.
А тепер про Штати питають, чи ти чистиш свій телефон перед тим, як ти туди заїжджаєш.
І я побачила унормованість всього. Стало зрозуміло, мені принаймні, там поспілкувавшись з певною кількістю людей, що Трамп на 4 роки, його адміністрація тут, просто, звісно, будь-яка сила, яка приходить після виборів, вона, скажімо так, десь стає більш опортуністичною, просто для того, щоб утримувати владу, десь вона загострює, десь щось використовує. Ми там і згадали і протести в Лос-Анджелесі, і інші речі, і загалом, зараз вже зрозуміло, що Трамп – це не аберація, це не особливість, це не якесь відхилення. Це велика частина Америки, і його підтримує велика кількість людей. Тут питання, що буде в наступні 2-4 роки.
Ти маєш на увазі, що це питання, яке часто виникає в тому числі у українців, а чого ж ви не чините спротив, там і так далі, і так далі. Ті, хто вважає за потрібне і в американській системі правовій, чинять насправді спротив. Ти маєш на увазі, що унормовано, ніби є загальний консенсус, давайте дамо президенту зробити свою справу за ці 4 роки, а там, якщо не сподобається, переоберемо. Щось в цьому роді.
Прийняття того, що його обрали, він буде керувати, багато чого зруйнує, але це його певне право, десь можна протестувати, десь вийде, десь не вийде, а десь те, що він робить, насправді, що виглядає для там європейців чи для його опонентів тим, що раптом зіб'є його рейтинги, навпаки, виявляється, є дуже популярним серед його певної групи підтримки. І те, що ми думали, що там, зараз в Трампа там сипеться рейтинг і є якесь там незадоволення його політикою, частина його прихильників є задоволені його політикою, і їх доволі багато. Цікаво було побачити, як от все середовище, є гостра критика, але з іншого боку, це влада, яка прийшла, і до неї її сприймають як владу, яка прийшла на наступні 4 роки. От вона така. От десь їх можна зупиняти, але вони з нами будуть, вони такі, з ними треба працювати, знаходити способи роботи.
Але цікаво, якщо Дамір займається питанням поляризації, дійсно цікаво, я не знаю, чи це ті самі протоптані вже доріжки, по яких відбуваються розлами і поляризація всередині американського суспільства, і яким воно буде після цих 4 років, а навіть, може, і менше. Але давай не будемо спойлерити цю розмову. Я впевнена, що якраз ви про ці питання і говорили. Давайте слухати розмову Наталки з американським редактором, аналітиком Даміром Марусичем.
Я хочу подякувати тим слухачам і слухачкам, які вже присилають нам підтримку. Наша бухгалтерія повідомляє, коли пройшли певні суми, і страшенно вдячні за це. Я нагадаю, що наш подкаст «Коли все має значення» не має якогось окремого фінансування. Ми його робимо з власної ініціативи і хочемо, щоб цю роботу підтримували, особливо заради нашої команди, чудової редакторки Іри Лопатіної і звукорежисерки Люби Гук. Якщо у вас є така можливість, будь ласка, є реквізити, вони є і на нашому сайті лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу, і там, де це можливо, на тих платформах, можливо, ви можете прочитати, як ці реквізити знайти, а ми працюємо над тим, щоб мати зручніший спосіб цієї сталої підтримки. Це не просто дуже приємно, це дуже надихає, спонукає до подальшої роботи, але дійсно є все-таки вагомим внеском. Тому дуже-дуже вдячні.
Дякуємо вам за ту підтримку, яку ви нам надаєте. Насправді для нас важить навіть найменша сума. Це дуже важливо для нашої команди, яка професійно працює з нашим подкастом і дає нам можливість і далі спілкуватися і шукати найкращих, найцікавіших гостей, яких ви з меншою долею вірогідності ще десь можете почути, послухати, почитати, яких ми спеціально для вас з Наталкою відбираємо з усього світу, буквально. Тому ми будемо вам дуже вдячні за посильний для вас донат на підтримку подкасту «Коли все має значення», нашої невеличкої команди. Ви зможете знайти реквізити на сайті лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу, а також на платформах, де є доступним наш подкаст, а це майже всі подкастингові платформи, які є доступними в Україні. Дуже вам дякую, почуємося.
I saw you last time. It was probably like 10 days before the US election.
It was before. You were at my house.
It was
the parties. We had the party. Yeah.
And you brought all kind of the people who sent me to Dearborn, who were critical. There was a person who was saying that, like, I want these Democrats, see how they lose, you know? But it was a very strong impression for me that people were not at all excited about Kamala. Maybe they were very critical about Trump, but they were not at all excited about her. And it was a good mixture compared to quite a lot of other, like, very supportive people or the people who are overcritical to Trump. A lot has changed since then, but before coming, I was told, like, 2 things. Some things were in DC. People were saying, like, everybody's depressed here, everybody's panicking. And the others would tell, you know what is weird? Nothing really is obvious because, you know, like, you see the normal life in New York, in here, not in LA today. But in generally, how would you describe this time here?
It's hard to say, you know, working at a newspaper and working just sort of in media, it's kind of difficult to tell what it's like for normal people because we're not normal. We have to follow this very closely. And it is exhausting in that sense. It's as if the administration is calibrated in such a way that every other day there's something new and seemingly crazier that happens. I think it's just perfectly human that after a while you don't have the capacity to register how crazy things are anymore, in the sense that it's just the novelty and overload basically is what happens. So, you know, I mean, I think for me personally, I'm not depressed. I'm a little tired. And it's only 6 months in, and it seems like it's too early to be tired for something like this. It's exhausting. I'll grant the administration one thing. They are very creative in everything that they're doing. It's very hard to predict what the next week will bring and what the next turn will be on all of this. Working at a paper, you're constantly trying to figure out where the next thing is going to be and how do you anticipate it. But we're playing catch up as much as anything else and reacting more than anticipating, much more than anticipating. It's mostly all reaction. And that's not great either. I think that element of media covering Trump, reacting to everything he does, that's excellent for Trump and not great for, I think, democracy and the rest of us.
You have this podcast which is called Wisdom of Crowds. I think it is a great summary. There is the episode which is called A Nation of Trumps, where your article is discussed. It has a title that, like, we deserve it all. If to put it in a nutshell, you were trying to explain that, Trump is not aberration, it's a bigger thing, and you cannot just, sit and cry. So, in a way, why the Americans deserve it all? I know it's a title.
It's a title. There's a tendency in very polarized times, I think, for tribes to blame the other one for where we're at. What is interesting after Trump is that the Democrats have been very quiet, almost in mourning, because perhaps maybe in some sort of metaphysical way, they do accept their share of the blame for it. But the reality is that Trump is a very American phenomenon. And I think that was a big mistake that people made the first time around, saying that, all the suppositions that he was Russia's plant and, under control of Moscow and the elections were stolen. I think a big part of the country could not admit to themselves that the country did in fact vote for Trump the first time. This time around, there's no doubt that the country voted for Trump. I would say the country as a whole, I think, is much more accepting of that. And in that sense, that's one sense in which we deserve it because, again, he won the elections. This is the vote of the people. And so everything that comes from this vote, we voted for it. Not the whole country, and it's not some kind of collective responsibility for it. But the other part is that the analysis is one of that Trump is a symptom as much as anything else of all the other political decay that's been going on in this country. And so I guess I'd say myself personally, it's something I wrestle with because, as I was saying earlier, it's so exhausting day to day watching and the new outrage, and you worry about the decline of this or that institution and where it's all headed. But overall, I have to feel that because Trump is a symptom of other ills, it's almost healthier to think of him as some kind of fever that is passing. At the other side of this, I think a lot of things will be changed. A lot of things will be destroyed. But I am optimistic that actually America will be able to, there'll be fertile ground after Trump for reinventing a lot of politics, a lot of things that I think have basically gone off the rails over the last, 20 years maybe. So, yeah, I think we're responsible for it. We are getting what we deserve, I guess, in a sense. But I think there's a way to be optimistic about it as well.
Ukrainians always, because we have this tradition of protest, and they're like, why people are protesting in this way? In protesting when you want to get rid of the president, for instance. I would say, yes, he was elected. So it's not like you can protest against a particular policies, but not against the fact that he has been elected. That's a different thing. So he'll be there unless he's impeached in a particular way for something, that kind of things. That I think that, for me, it should be very clear. Don't expect, unless he does, that would be the protest.
But as you said, though, right? I mean, today as we're recording, we do have actual protests in LA happening. I was sounding optimistic and maybe, even maybe a little glib there. I don't think that the LA thing will necessarily spiral into anything bigger. And by bigger, I mean worse. Not in the sense that protests will be bigger. You get the sense with the LA protests that he's been waiting for this. He's been waiting for civil unrest somewhere and send in the army, right? Your listeners probably don't remember, but they can Google it. There was an op-ed that came out, I don't know the date, but it caused a lot of trouble for the New York Times. It was Tom Cotton's op-ed about sending in the troops after the George Floyd protests and, riots that happened across the country. He called for sending in the National Guard and the army in to put this stuff down. The New York Times had a meltdown at the time. Anyway, it's a long story, but it just goes to show that politically, even in the first Trump administration, there's the temptation, of course. As soon as you have those kinds of protests, you send in the troops. And that's, again, I'm not going to pretend it hasn't happened in American history before. Obviously, it has. But for my generation, it really didn't that much, right? This is a 1960s phenomenon when you'd have this sort of stuff. You'd have it much less. We had riots in Seattle, had the riots in LA with the Rodney King stuff. This feels different. It feels on a different scale and more menacing for whatever reason. Sending in the troops to not just protect property and, prevent rioting and all the rest of that, but it feels like it's motivated to deter opposition and protest. It feels like it's an intimidation.
I don't know, maybe I'm just so kind of expecting everything here. My phone is full of the emails from the people who knew I'm in the US, which is also very strange, I say like, and what's happening in the LA? What is happening like that? But it's not normal. Because I'm saying like, no, things are not that unusual, in New York, in DC, because I remember the Floyd protests. There was violence. And when you really compare the, American National Guard being deployed, it looks a bit different than the ones in Europe. They're just always heavy guarded. Like when you see the American National Guard at any protest, like for my eye, it's too much. So that's why I'm thinking like, what's new about this LA thing? But you just explained that it's like really, it's not worth it because that was not the, as you said, like riots in Seattle, or it was not something what they were doing in Portland.
Yeah,
which was
that's right. No, it feels like it's unnecessary to be doing this right now. But it's hard to tell, as we're recording this, we'll see, if the protests swell or not. It seems like they didn't have to do it. They didn't have to send it in, and they were just really excited to do it. This was an opportunity. That feels like, again, a certain kind of decay in whatever, the American social contract that doesn't feel good.
We're sitting in front of the screen, which is not switched on, so there is no like CNN Fox on it. But what would we do? Like, are these like protests in LA today, like everywhere in the news, or in the US is just so big that people like, yeah, there are things in... That's not I'm asking about exactly this protest, but I'm exactly trying to understand how such things are felt, like as something like super big, or just like, okay, there is a National Guard in the LA, it's expected.
We were focused on it. The interesting thing is that it took, from what I understand, the riots started, and actually the big East Coast newspapers weren't covering it on Saturday. And it was on Sunday where the stories really broke. And that was around the time when the National Guard and other things started, going up. The visuals are, if you turn on the TV, you will see scenes of rioting, but as you know, as a journalist, you really have to be there to really get a sense. TV is incredibly distorting to see what this looks like and what the scale of it is. It doesn't look great, and insofar as these sorts of things happen, I do think polls are against cities burning. They turn against protesters for that sort of stuff. Even if polling on immigration is complicated as well, is the other problem, right? Is that what Trump is doing is not inherently unpopular. It's really an ugly situation. Look, the main thing is that the paradox is that cracking down on immigration is not unpopular. For a much smaller subset of really excited Trump voters, I think the cruelty of the Trump administration towards immigrants is also popular. And that cruelty drives protests from normal people, not just activists, but people who think, okay, maybe we don't want more immigration, but this is too much and it's not who we are. And so this polarizes even more, I think, and it creates an opportunity for the kind of things that he is doing. One of the debates we were having in the newsroom, talking to colleagues, is this a story that will die out tomorrow because the riots are not that big? He proves his point and, they stand down, or is it now going to spiral? Is it going to spread to other cities and will it give him more opportunities to do other things? We'll see.
I'll still return to this, your article, which refers to the Lincoln's second inaugural, something the Americans know, but Ukrainians don't. What was so interesting for me to see, it's really about this responsibility. What the title is, like we all deserve it. It also says like we can do something about that. If you deserve it, you can do something about that. If not, so it's not really about like just putting the blame, but more or less also a bit of the agency. You literally were also very explaining, which also was so striking for me, this Lincoln inaugural, where you mentioned that, Lincoln, he didn't just blame the South for the slavery, but it also said that, or just said like, we are in the North, the writers, we are the ones, and they are the blame. But this war is tragedy for all of us. Maybe you would explain this concept and why you brought it into this particular context of today.
The whole essay has a bit of an arc, and it starts because a very smart and religious colleague of mine was reading the prophet Jeremiah in the Bible at the beginning. There you have, it's at the start of it is it's the idea that there's a kind of lament of what's happening and sort of a lamenting of fate that is approaching. What's interesting about Lincoln, I think, about that pose is that it's both not fatalistic at all, in the sense that it's not being resigned to fate, but it is being resigned to basically that all of this is bigger than we can basically understand. That any human being at any place, when caught up in such big events, can, maybe only grasp a small part of it and not really grasp. Anyone who then reaches for simple moralizations about these sorts of things is not doing anyone any good. I think that's the main thing you might take away from Lincoln. I mean, it's a very religiously inflected speech. I mean, it's something that I think is very much, certainly with Trump, is lost, but it's been lost for several decades in this country, that you have a kind of religious literacy and the speech making can really rely on that. What's beautiful about the Lincoln speech is that, it's a kind of acceptance of both a kind of fate and agency at the same time. It does not deny the existence of good and evil, but it does not take for any one actor the role of complete villain or complete hero. That there's a kind of acceptance that to exist in the world is that we're all somehow participants and sinning somehow, I think. It's a very Christian idea, right, that Lincoln is leveraging there. And when you read that, you see ultimately that he is looking beyond the war. And this is a civil war, and he's seeing that there's going to be a period where you're going to have to knit this country together. So he's pulling back the triumphalism of the North and basically mourning the greater tragedy of what a civil war does to a country, and then tries to, again, sort of share the blame basically for it.
You said, really said like the kind of the political decade of 20 years already. So what is this political decay? How would you describe it? And we started the conversation from the fact that the Democrats are mourning. Like they're not really doing something beyond like AOC and Bernie, who are traveling around the country. I think like people should do something. So what's happening with them?
The years that maybe lead up to this, I wrote an essay several years ago about sort of trying to map this out. It's arbitrary where you can draw the line. You can draw the line at Nixon, where there was a big rupture in politics in America, and basically a sense that things would have to change after that, with Nixon being impeached and stepping down, a lot of bad blood there. But arguably, the real turning point was in the 1991 Republican National Convention, ahead of the elections there. I don't think he was young at that point, but still in his prime, a man called Pat Buchanan gave a speech at the National Convention. It was notable in the sense that the Cold War had ended, and his speech was pronouncing that, with the enemy of global communism now vanquished, but there are now enemies within the United States that need confronting. And he spent a lot of time talking about the Clintons and, the sort of kind of decadence of Democrats and all the rest of that. And so, look, I also strove very hard in that essay and since then to not try and figure out who started it, because I think this is why Lincoln is very important. It's not really useful to start talking about, this was the real sort of start of that, and therefore we blame this side, and that's the whole cycle. But if you look since then, you have this sort of growing cycle of retribution and lack of trust and decay in American politics that builds. And ultimately, you know, I mean, they're going after Obama for his birth certificate, and one Donald Trump is behind all of that. And by the time it gets to Donald Trump, the level of animosity has, I think, grown so much among Democrats as well that they delegitimize the correct election of Donald Trump the first time around. They, under Biden, I think, really do try and prosecute and bring a lot of law to bear against a former president who is still likely to run. It's that cycle, I think, specifically since, well, you can say it's since the end of the Cold War, but really, I think it picks up from Obama on, that you are getting this kind of sense of just degradation. Each time you go around, the political system gets more degraded. The level of trust in the system, in your fellow citizen, gets worse and worse. And that's what's troubling about this. And with this, what Trump is doing, and what we were talking about, the riots and the enforcement and the army sending, that in, and it just feels like it's more and more of that delegitimization of the entire system, of like not trusting the other half of the country anymore. And yeah, I think Democrats are asleep. I don't fully understand why. I've been told by people who are more plugged into the Democrats themselves is that they're having their own civil war right now. I do a lot of foreign policy stuff. I understand that Democrats literally are ready to punch each other in the face over Gaza. This is a huge, huge division, but that these divisions go across the board on all sorts of things. So look, I mean, signs of life for Democrats. It's worth watching what happens in New York City. The new lefty mayor that just got endorsed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, very dynamic young man, very hard left from the look of things, going up against Cuomo. We'll see.
At the same time, of course, there was inflation. When we were, speaking during the elections, a lot of people were speaking about inflation, economic things. And, now everything, after the talk about the tariffs, after everything's happened, it feels like one was as concerned because, actually things which might happen with the economy can be, totally way more complicated and difficult. But what I think was also still interesting, you're speaking about this political decay, but you really knew that the US are very prosperous and the economy was doing really well. Mainly also because of the things, like there is no social welfare state. It's a really complicated country. You really don't want to be poor here. You really will die here if you're kind of poor, or if you lose the job, you can become right away homeless, even if you're like a former State Department person fired today in one day from USAID, like you can't pay your mortgage and you're on the street, like you really can die. So it's a very thing, but at the same time, this kind of the diversity, the tax system, but also the fact that there are so many states with more dynamic policies which change the law very fast, create the stimulus for the economy. And also, disregarding, you speak about the migration, you need people. When you have more people, when you have a big economy and more people in the market, economy is doing well. Usually the recession comes and the problem comes when people are leaving the country. So, and the US was one of the countries which bring people here. So like half a year, it was like after the COVID, it felt like it's a great economy. It's even better than you thought. So does it mean that the economy doesn't matter that much?
We're doing fine, even despite all the tariffs for now. Again, I think this could end up not sounding that great in a few months, or maybe not, Like I don't know if this made it to you and your listeners, but there was a little news boomlet last week, maybe the week before. Some journalist asked Trump about the taco trade. So this was apparently a joke, or not even a joke, sort of an acronym that they came up with on Wall Street. Taco. Trump always chickens out. And it was having to do with basically negotiations on tariffs, or basically any of the threats that he makes.
Trump always chickens out. That's
chickens
kind of,
out.
Yeah.
That's taco. So it's like the Mexican food, and Trump always chickens out. The funny thing there is that, to a certain extent, markets presumably have internalized the fact that to not take Trump's threats that seriously. Trump lost his mind when the journalist asked him. He said, how dare you ask this? A terrible question. You mustn't ask this question. Because if the markets are pricing this in, then his adversaries are pricing it in as well. And then, all these threats aren't credible. I mean, I think Trump understands this very well. But then the question is, I think to a bigger point of yours, it's not, does the economy not matter? I think the economy does matter. The other thing that comes out of all of Trump's policies on the economy and the rest of it, it's quite possible that policies don't matter, that government doesn't matter, that the country is prosperous and rich enough that it'll always find a way to work around whatever stupidity is done in this town of Washington. Obviously, at the margins, it matters what your tax rate is and what your tariff policy is, and markets can get, they do want predictability, they don't like the volatility, these things are bad, but maybe we end up just fine. The thing that has been occupying a lot of journalists now is this question of whether this bill that is working its way through Congress right now, the Big Beautiful Bill, that's actually the name that they gave the bill. It's officially called the Big Beautiful Bill, which is actually a sizable increase to the deficit at a time that, sort of uncertainty and all the rest of that. Whether this is going to now have long-term bad impacts on interest rates go up, people won't lend money to the United States, whether people start selling treasuries, all sorts of questions. I'm not an economist. I'm not going to hazard a question on this, but I wouldn't rule out at the same time that again, the ultimate aggregate success and wealth of this country is so big that even on global financial markets, even mismanagement on the scale that this administration is doing, again, it has an effect, but doesn't really meaningfully dent it so much that it harms the country permanently.
We've spoken as well about domestic issues, but you for a while were executive editor of the American Interest, which is the magazine founded by Frank Fukuyama, foreign policy, international affairs, global economy, military matters. And it's exactly what you really think but that dramatically changed. Because isolation is, okay, it was always somehow in some discourse you can discuss which politicians were isolationist, but such a withdrawal and retreat from the American kind of ambition to even look like a superpower is, I find it probably the biggest change, if you really think about that. Do you think that it's kind of this trust to the US might be gone by the allies, partners, and the US really, let's say that, already lost to China, meaning that people already think that the US is withdrawing, the China is the next bigger power with ambition to conquer the world, of being present. Because, I had this feeling that for a long time, as a Ukrainian, I couldn't understand why everybody speaks about China. Why everybody speaks about China? Is China the big, China also COVID problem? And people usually say after a lot of wars and conflicts, it's not about whether China is big. If somebody withdrew, Britain during the Second World War, then the US come on board. So we were waiting for this time that maybe China would come as somebody who has this ambition to be present. When Trump was speaking about the first tariffs or something, or sending the people from the US back to Colombia. I've been in Colombia that day in the airport. And talking at that day to the local political journalists, he would say that's a small thing, we'll deal with the president and Trump and this feud on Twitter. The real story is the Americans would be gone and the Chinese will come to us. So I feel that this is changing. What are your thoughts about this kind of global, or this retreat from this global dominance, which was there for 80 years?
Very complicated question. I think it's worth trying to. I don't think you and I will succeed to do this, but it's worth trying to unpack a little bit several strands of what's happening. There's a retreat from giving voice to a certain set of liberal Western values. That's real. But how important is that is the next question. I think certainly not unimportant. Certainly sends all sorts of signals. But as a Ukrainian, I can certainly say it as originally someone from the Balkans. In general, Ukraine's not a small country, but most small countries around the world have a more jaundiced view of superpowers. They talk a good game about this, that, the other thing, freedom, values, and et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you want the big gorilla on your side against your neighboring big gorilla, smaller gorilla. And alliances, values help, but ultimately you do what you need to do to get the alliance. For example, the happier case for my country, Croatia, after our wars, the country moved heaven and earth to get into the EU and NATO for reasons of, the Balkans and for our own sort of security. And obviously there's a lot of talk about shared values and the importance of that. But even if it wasn't for shared values, we'd be doing anything we could to get into the EU and NATO because of just hard security concerns. I think what Trump has done is certainly, just discarded all this values talk. So that's real. I think it's sometimes overstated about how important that is to lasting trust. More significant is that he's decided that he has had enough with Europe not spending its share on military defense stuff. This is not Trump alone. This has been a sore point among bipartisan administrations, both sides, for a very long time. There's a really great clip worth tracking down of Donald Trump in his first term yelling at Jens Stoltenberg, lecturing Jens Stoltenberg, what I think came, I don't remember exactly what date, to talk about how Trump's pressure on NATO allies has really yielded and now everyone is spending more. And Trump turns to him and starts lecturing him. It's worth watching because, again, I think it's very easy to caricature Trump for someone who's just gets angry or whatever, but it's actually a very substantive lecture. A little circular because he's angry, but he starts yelling at him about Nord Stream 2 in Germany. He says, how much money is Germany literally giving to Russia? So we have to defend Germany from Russia. For how many billions of dollars per year are you giving to Russia, and you're spending how much on your defense for us to protect you from Russia? And again, he's right. He's absolutely right about that. And I think that was broadly felt. And there was one bit in his rant which I think was fantastic. He goes, a lot of the people who were president before me felt the same way, but I don't think they really clearly understood what was wrong, or they didn't know what to do about it. He said, I'm going to change this. This is not going to be like this. I think it's important to recognize as well the kind of hypocrisy among Europeans who also cry about the values and all that going away. But at the same time, what they're really crying after is the fact that Trump is playing a very hard bargain on this sort of stuff, and that the idea that they would not have to spend more of their GDP on collective security and defense, that's finally going away after all this time. I don't know, Natalia, where this ends up. I don't know exactly the extent to which this is kind of what we're talking about, the taco trade, bluffs, bullying, where this ends up. And for Ukraine, obviously, it's even more complicated because of Trump's attitudes towards Ukraine, his political history, and it's hard to tell. I don't know what actually goes on in his head. But on the transatlantic security thing, I do think that the end result of all of this will be not necessarily America that says we're completely outdone, but that there will be a strong rebalancing in the burden sharing on this sort of stuff. And that's not all bad.
The rebalancing is definitely not bad. For me, when people are asking somewhere, I'm saying at least the Europeans are coming to their senses. It feels okay. Yet the question is, especially with the support to Ukraine by the Europeans, when you speak about the weapon, very practical things, they would say we're very dependent on the US, so we cannot go against, because in fact this supply chain is so connected that the Swedish jets have some details which are British and American, and we are not capable to produce on their own. So we need to be in good terms because the license is in the US. And we cannot just buy the Patriot for Ukraine without the permission, because at that exactly moment when there was this kind of very abrupt pause in the military aid to Ukraine on early March, when I talked to quite a lot of people, the question that what Ukrainians told, that the trick is that the Americans also sell just to the allies and partners. So if you are in the bad terms with the US, they can always stop, change something, forbid you to use it. And that what was understood at that day. Of course, they want the American pay. Of course, people still have their budgets. It's very unpleasant to cut the budget in Sweden, in UK, everywhere, in Europe, and to put it into defense. It's politically not popular, and also like wherever you say prosperous countries, but budgets are not infinite. Yet this question is still not clear with this kind of the way how Trump to speak to Russia. And the question, like, does he really, just want to make some deal with Russia just because he's fascinated by this country? And Ukraine for him is like something small and just such a destruction, which is on his way, is just blocking his way to make this beautiful deal about, nuclear proliferation or something like that, for instance. Or he's really, can play the game, because what was happening that some people in his camp, they were trying to speak about the elections in Germany. They were trying to speak about, Greenland. They were trying to really speak as if the Europeans are the enemies, adversaries.
So there was an article in today's Wall Street Journal, that Europeans surprised at the change of tone just in the last week. Now, this doesn't mean that in the week later it won't go back to the other thing, because it's mercurial and it shifts way, this way, the other. I think the Merz visit last week went surprisingly well. The tone has been softening towards the Europeans, especially as more news has percolated out about more spending on this. On Ukraine and what does he want with Russia, I really hesitate to speculate, because I really just don't know. We all have, nice ideas about this, and we can try and psychoanalyze the guy. My favorite psychoanalysis, of course, is this one, is that, insofar as he has weird obsessions with Obama, he really wants the Nobel Peace Prize. That is the one thing that Obama got that he thinks Obama didn't deserve, and he really wants it. So look in that context, look at the negotiations ongoing right now with Iran, and potentially the negotiations going with, Ukraine and Russia. The argument, I would say, one way to look at it, I'm not making a claim that this is how it is, but maybe, it's a way to at least try and wrap your head around it. I don't think that the substance of the Iran deal matters that much to Trump. He's hungry for a deal, to just basically say, I did it. I got a deal. Even if it's the same deal that he ends up overthrowing, even if it's JCPOA, repackaged a little bit, and it's called the Trump-Iran nuclear deal. He can then go for 6 months and say, I'm the big peacemaker. And then, 6 months later, announce that the Iranians are cheating on the nuclear thing, and we're back to the same thing. And the story keeps going, and he's doing this. On Russia, I guess I would suspect that he really did think that there was a means of, that the Russians were tired. I don't get it. But that he thought this would be easier. Rumors were that after he won the election, he was saying this would be done in how many, a month, 100 days? I forget what he was saying. That would be super quick. It was leaking already before he came into office that he was coming to realize that Ukraine would not be a quick solution. But again, all of this theorizing still doesn't explain why he hasn't taken the next logical step, which most American policymakers over time come to recognize, which is that, and this is something that the great George Kennan recognized very early on and wrote in the X article and the long telegram, that the Soviets at the time, the Russians, keep pushing until they find a adequate counterforce and adequate pushback that they can't push back any further. At that point, maybe you can talk. You'd think that someone like Donald Trump, who as a real estate business developer, as someone working in real estate, has to constantly be dealing with mafia-type people, and, this is the kind of business that this is in, one would imagine that he would have an appreciation of that kind of logic. And yet it's not there. Which then gets you to the question of what's happening here? And I don't know. I recoil from this idea that some Democrats still hold in their mind that Putin has something on Trump. I don't buy it. I just don't buy that's the cause of it. Is he just not willing to invest and to escalate? Is he actually intimidated by Putin on this at the limit? Maybe that's it. I don't know.
When I mentioned this nuclear non-proliferation, there was recently quite a good talk by Fiona Hill, a former security advisor who obviously is kind of critical today, when she really explained how obsessed Trump was with the idea of the nuclear, like that the only threat, there is no climate crisis, like, because the only scary thing is nuclear winter. So he really was like, I can do it with Russia. I'll do this nuclear deal. So, she referred very clearly that like there is something about him to make the deal with Russia also, not just with Iran, because he comes from this generation of the people.
And remember, North Korea was the other one that he spent a lot of capital trying to do a nuclear deal with.
She was really saying like how often he speaks about nuclear, how much is in his mind, and also telling about this generation of him and Biden, who just grew up with the whole child, the films, the movies of the 80s, of all these type of things. But interesting what you said about the real estate and mafia. So maybe Witkov in this role is not that bad. We were all laughing about, meaning like that the guy doesn't understand foreign policy, but he's like the real estate agent. So, should be the guy who is, like just dealing with mafia, be the ones who dealing with a different type of mafia.
The only thing I'll say, I don't know. Again, reporting in this is very hard, and you find different people who are willing to talk, and none of them are on the record, and they'll say different things. On Ukraine, on arming Ukraine, or at least supporting Ukraine, even though this budget, goes up, it actually doesn't have a lot more wiggle room for a lot of things. But there's still, as I understand it, a fair bit of drawdown authority that was left over from Biden, that they don't have to go to Congress to do anything else. And that's not talked about that much. But I'm not sure that at least in the however many, probably certainly through the fall, through this, fighting season that's coming up, there are real hard limits on certain things that are coming up, like basically Patriots and other things. I mean, I think there's a bottleneck there in production. I guess military planners are getting nervous about American stockpiles before they're sort of giving those out. And these are real things, but I don't think you're going to get another hiccup like you did when he turned off everything around the mineral deal, at least not in the coming months. Again, I hope I'm not proven wrong and that he says, we're walking away and abandoning Ukraine tomorrow. I don't get the sense that that's where they're going at this point, even though, for whatever reason, he felt compelled that he needed to explain to the rest of the world that Putin is righteously angry and is now going to act out by lobbing a whole shit ton of rockets and, to get his revenge on Ukraine. I think Ukraine will continue to get support in the interim as, whatever steps are taken to continue whatever negotiations that they think they're going to be able to push through.
Why do you think that things kind of a bit normalized? Because, of course, the Oval Office meeting was kind of huge. Like, it was big because, I've been traveling and talking to the people globally. Like, I would know the editor who has literally from Moldova had a heart attack, literally a heart attack because of that. I would know, like, a Jordanian artist who watched the video, like, 5 times or like, so, it kind of drew this global attention to extent I wouldn't even understand. Of course, we all watched, but we are the Ukrainians. Then later there were all kind of other meetings and the tone was softened. It's not easy, but it's like you live in this reality also. But do you think like in DC that like things are kind of normalized, that like it was like the culmination?
I'm not going to, again, hard to even explain the extent to which, well, I think in many ways what you're dealing with here in this administration is, it really is the rule of one man and an entire administration that is trying to navigate his own sort of things. He is not consistent, but presumably he thinks he is consistent, Donald Trump himself. The extent to which all of that was some kind of signaling to Ukraine to sign that mineral deal. However, there was that great reporting, by the way, right, that the mineral deal was Zelensky's own idea before the elections. And then, unfortunately, Trump latched on to some small version of it and then ended up...
There was a menu. There were a lot of offers. There was the one which doesn't harm Russia in some way. They pick it up.
He picks that one. Yeah, dangerous things to have ideas. The interesting thing, looking back on it right now, is, rattle the chain, Ukraine signed, may not be a great deal for it, but okay, done what needed to be done. But the fact that everyone watched, I think is another interesting and important thing to notice. And it's not so much to notice, that everyone watched and was wondering about Ukraine, but everyone watched and said, oh, what does this mean for me?
Honestly, I cannot any longer to look at this setup. When you see another president in that room, you wait for a show. You think like, what will happen to Macron? Okay,
Yeah,
it's quite a show. You see the setup.
That's right.
And you're like, what happens today?
The South African was incredible.
Well, the South African was incredible.
That was incredible.
Everything. And like, especially for like Ukrainian, you look at that like, I've seen that picture. Interesting.
I don't want to give them this much credit because I doubt they had a meeting about it. And I want to like be careful to not say that because I think it's all impulsive Trump stuff. It's not like he and Vance decided ahead of time that they're going to do this to Zelensky. I think Vance has its own agenda and sort of resentments, and he wanted to get in there and trip him up. And Trump was just sort of reacting to it. But I think that after they'd done it, I think they realized to a certain extent that the externalities, what we were talking about earlier about allies and the rest of that, that sending this kind of signal to everyone, just basically, look, Ukraine is so dependent on us, and look how we will treat them if we want to. So basically everyone's on notice. It's a signaling kind of thing, and interesting that it didn't last, that the signal was sent. And again, I think Ukraine had to sign the deal as a result of it and all the rest of that. But now, as you said, it has normalized. It absolutely has normalized to some other kind of thing. When the drone operation happened, I was a little surprised that Trump didn't, at least publicly the next day, start attacking Ukraine for being reckless and the rest of that. Only after he talked to Putin afterwards, he said, well, such a tragedy, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it was a lot more muted than I thought it would have been, especially given that no notice was given to the United States about it.
You said that like, yes, it's a very personal politics. He wants to rule it as a tsar, as like kind of emperor. Anyways, but there is a feud with Musk, there is J.D. Vance, and there is a particular circle. So what are these people then? Do they influencing? Of course, we understand everybody wants to have ambition. J.D. Vance wants to run. Elon Musk has his all kind of the ideas, what he wanted to do. So is it really just like Trump, or there are also now the other interests which maybe try to play with Trump but do something else which may matter and which you cannot ignore, because there is a pretty consistency in what J.D. Vance tells about Europeans. There was quite consistent things from what Elon Musk was trying to, either achieve.
Return to the bigger question. But on J.D. Vance, for example, the Munich speech, well noted, deeply covered, he's walked it back a lot. In many he's not walked it back. He's still angry about the social issues and the rest of that. But the tone has changed from J.D. Vance on Europe as well. I would say, look, the reality is that, and you can see it with what happened with Elon Musk just last week, is that everyone in the White House on that team knows that they're there at the ultimate sufferance of the emperor. The emperor, condones. And the emperor likes a court. It's classic court politics. Obviously, there's intrigue. Everyone's trying to, whether it's a narrow thing or a wider thing, everyone's trying to be at the table, trying to have influence. And the emperor, the king, understands that these people are trying to get him things out of him. And he tolerates it until he doesn't. The Musk story is spectacular, even most spectacular because everyone predicted it would happen at some point, that two men with such egos, at some point would come to blows, that it wouldn't last. And my money was always that Trump would come out ahead because he's the president. I mean, I don't care if you're the richest man in the world, doesn't matter. Musk really, I think, misunderstood American politics and misunderstood how much money there is in America as well, that even the richest man is not that important, ultimately. That, you can't buy that level of power, and Trump understands that very well. We'll see where this all ends up now, but...
yeah, it's always, I'm Ukrainian, reading the foreign news, and then sometimes surprised how Ukraine is covered. But, as a journalist, we all know there is this kind of perception, especially that everywhere things are going kind of crazy. However, there is this level of normalcy. That would be too much of, this kind of writing about even Trump supporters disapprove what he does on tariffs, disapproves on what he does to Ukraine. So is it just wishful thinking by some of the, let's say, liberals or liberal media or other thinkers who try to reconfirm their hope
I do think it's a little bit like that. It's kind of like maybe the best way to think about it. And I don't know, I haven't looked into the polling on issue by issue. It's worth thinking about. There was a storyline that kept going around for a very long time about Brexit regret. Regret, they called it. That it shows up in polling. People voted and they're like, I didn't know what I voted for. Oh my goodness. And Brexit is still here. Nigel Farage may be the next prime minister of the UK. I mean, not anytime soon, but, you know, the Conservatives are disappearing. A British journalist friend of mine threw another idea in my head yesterday, which I think is phenomenal. It said, if it's Nigel Farage and is doing very well as reform, maybe the Conservatives bring Bojo back, Boris Johnson, as, you know, to try and bring the party out of the ditch that they've driven themselves in. But again, the reality of Brexit is such, and I think no one any longer believes in regret. I mean, it's just a new reality has sort of dawned. I would say that there isn't this feeling that Trump's approval ratings are sinking precipitously about this one policy or another policy. He's not popular. Doesn't have a massive mandate. It's not like he is unassailable. And if the economy starts going really south, yeah, I think popularity will go bad. If, you know, I don't know, the country ends up with riots and cities are burning, you know, he'll have some sympathy from people who want law and order restored. But overall, if the country's unstable, people won't like that, and his popularity will suffer at the limit. So yeah, I don't think it's this sense right now that there's a very well-organized resistance to any of this, no.
I generally don't believe in regret in mass. I always try explain, like while talking to people in Crimea, the ones who were not really openly resisting the occupation. And there are some people like that. And like, it just emotionally very hard to admit for a human being that you were stupid enough to do something stupid, that you've made a mistake. Literally, for any human, you always try to justify your action. I was in that situation. There was a reason. This guy, you know, messed it up, but my decision was not that stupid. It's like there is something in human psycho. So unless it's really, really bad, you know, you can change your next vote. But you would tell that, yes, Trump was needed as a favor. We needed to show it. I regretted I did it, but probably I won't change my mind, you know, so retrospectively things are not changeable, you know, and that's what exactly this analogy with Brexit is really good. But still, what do you think are the things to watch out? Because immigration is unpopular in the US if you speak about the majority and even some, but the idea that like it may be scary in the US, that you know, kind of, I don't know, like you can be deported, you can be wherever, and there is some, I would say, the ICE, this, if it's correctly to, this acronym means like immigration, custom, enforcement. It's like extrajudicially. It's like, it's not about the court. You literally can put a person in a private prison for months and in limbo. So it sounds like a bit scary.
Yeah, that's not popular. You know, and it's one of those things, yeah, I criticize Democrats on this one. I think the better political messaging on that would have been basically to hammer on that point that you just made, which is this is extra legal. Governments make mistakes all the time. Why would you trust these people to get it right? And they can pull you off the street and you end up in some prison in El Salvador without a record of you or anything like that. Instead, the argument for the one case that, you know, jumped out into the public consciousness, Abrego Garcia, this man who was actually just returned to the United States last week. One of the big cases was there was a man who was here illegally. Abrego Garcia was his last name, and he was snatched up and basically sent. He himself was Salvadoran, El Salvador nationality. He had applied for not full asylum, but a certain kind of stay of deportation that had been granted to him in the United States. He lived in Maryland, saying that if he was sent back to El Salvador, his life was in danger because he had some connections with gangs and he had fled gangs in El Salvador and come here. He perhaps was mixed up in some gang activity here, and in any case, the Trump administration said, he's clearly a criminal, we have to deport him, he was supposed to be deported, and they didn't give him any kind of due process with the law to have a trial or anything before deporting him. And in fact, went against the explicit ruling that he must not be sent to El Salvador, his own country, for safety reasons. Democrats made a case that he was a family man with a wife and child, and they made a very human interest kind of case for him. He's a complicated man who may have been mixed up in other things. There was even some stories I didn't follow enough closely to see, but there were allegations that there was domestic violence involved. And the mistake is to make a moral hero out of a person rather than make the political case, which is, don't let the government be this powerful and this unaccountable because it can come knock you down. Rather, they went for the easier, more emotional case. Father, husband, in the middle of the night, snatched and taken away. How, have empathy and feeling for this. Finish the story is that the Supreme Court said, this is completely illegal what you have done. Said you must bring him back. A couple of weeks ago, there was this whole big song and dance, and it was quite troubling because the administration was pretending that the Supreme Court had actually ruled the opposite of what it actually had. Stephen Miller, who is Trump's big immigration enforcer, was saying that they had won at the Supreme Court when they hadn't. Then when more rulings said, no, you actually have to bring him down, was threatening and saying this is unacceptable, judicial coup and all the rest of that. Finally, last week, quietly, they obeyed the courts and brought him back. But they come up with a reason to do it, which is to say, we have new charges for him. We're going to try him in the United States on these other charges of gangland activity and all the rest of that. So it's a missed opportunity for Democrats because now their moral hero is now going to get dragged through the courts on some stuff that may or may not be right, whereas the opportunity was missed to make the case that I think is the much more understandable one.
In fact, we would tell that, but also would tell to our listeners that recently we did one of the podcasts. It's based on actually the talk we made on rethinking the human rights reporting in the polarized world. And that's something which we're trying as an organization to push. We do very emotional stories. We do this kind of human stories, but I would insist that they're not really working for the audience which oppose the cause. And especially you mentioned earlier that if there are some people who are proud of cruelty, they actually don't feel ashamed to be cruel, not any longer. In fact, this moral thing doesn't work because maybe years ago it was possible to say name and shame. I was also in a different discussion with very classical human rights organization CEOs and founders, and I could formulate this idea, but they were still insisting that the idea of name and shame, it's what's driving human rights organization. I just think it doesn't work. You need to name and shame. It's okay. Also, you can have moral arguments. I mean, I really think the moral exists. It's important. Some things are immoral. The war can be fought in immoral way and in efficient way. But it doesn't cut through to the people who disagree. They don't buy it. And people any longer, and that's what changed with the discourse of the humanity with this particular administration. You allowed not to care, and this nihilism takes away your responsibility to act. So that's an issue also with the Gaza coverage, sometimes, unfortunately. And it's very, very unfortunate, but I think that it's, we're returning, in fact, to the very initial start of our conversation about Lincoln, this second inaugural, which I learned by talking to you. I have no idea it existed, that in this complex, polarized time, especially if it's complex, it's sometimes the moral arguments don't work. It may be simply, if you speak about the war against Ukraine, there should be some moral arguments in this regard. But yeah, I do understand. So I think there should be some way to those who want to not to all Trump supporters, but to some of them, to rethink how you address it.
It's a funny moment, right? Because it's driven by built-up resentments, I think, in a large chunk of people. In foreign policy, I think it's interesting, again, comparing to what Brexit was. Brexit was before Trump, and it was a sense of resentment at, and it does tie into, I think, the idea of universal human rights and all these things that were tied to Western ideas about itself, that the entire concept of the self-concept of the West about itself had embedded in it a bunch of hypocrisy as well. that there was a sense of aspiring for a kind of universal good that while neglecting the local good, I would say. And so that breaks down on the level of the nation state versus things like the EU. And it certainly broke badly for Britain. Enough people felt enough resentment that I think they were able to say that all this nice talk about universal values is actually hypocrisy. And so they felt once you break that taboo, then you're just fueled by resentment. The reason I'm pushing back on one thing you said, that it's just nihilism. I think pragmatically you can say back, yes, it is nihilistic, but it's reactionary is the better way to put it. It's a reaction. It's a reaction to a set of perceived hypocrisies. And you'll see it, I think the thing to understand about Trump voters, and I think a lot of the stuff that's happening on the right now, we're talking about transatlantic burden sharing, all the rest of that. Again, it's a sense of we're being played for suckers. That drives a lot of this. You'll notice that a lot of the arguments about supporting Ukraine that were coming from the right, J.D. Vance and the rest of them, were saying, why? Why do we need to be like giving this money to this? This is not our war. Like we're constantly asked to, get involved in wars and spend money on wars and the rest of that. This is where J.D. Vance himself, I think radicalized by Iraq and the rest of this, said, we're constantly getting pushed that we have all sorts of responsibilities to the world for good things and values, but we were sold all sorts of things in Iraq as values and the importance, and that all turned out to be a lie. The Europeans have not been carrying their weight. Look how prosperous they have. Look at the nice social safety nets they have, and we're supporting them. And again, go back to that, watch that clip of Trump lecturing Stoltenberg about, because there are hypocrisies. There were many hypocrisies embedded in it. So only thing I'd caution you there is that I think just it's important to realize that it's not just nihilism and a sense of now I'm free to be nihilistic. It is more tied to reaction and resentment. How do you break through that? I don't know. But I think that's going on.
Do you think it differs? Because for some people, it's like literally this type of yes, it's the resentment is there. Because the more I think about that, I thought maybe hypocrisy is still a bit better than the pure denial of any good. Because in hypocrisy, you at least can say, this is bad, this is good, you shouldn't do that. I'm really speaking about human life as something precious, the law as something precious. I was recently also writing a lot because I was asked this question about there would be 50 years of the Helsinki Accord and existing of all these organizations. So there was this debates I've participated, should we keep that or should we totally dismantle? But when you really think we better keep it and fix hypocrisy rather than, throw it away to the bin. But when you speak about Putin and the other people, you really understand there is this kind of thin line when at the moment it was still kind of resentment against hypocrisy global, but then it becomes this pure cruelty. There is in this discourse, then there is a moment when you can go to that side.
And then look, just to build on what you said there, on top of that, there's a slide towards cruelty. There's also, it's an incredible opportunity for cynicism, for cynical politicians to use this and ride this to wherever they need to. Not denying that at all. But I just push on one thing on human rights, because the other really is when we strip aside, leave Ukraine out of it, put your finger on where the resentment comes from and what fueled Trump's rise, what fueled Brexit, what is still fueling populism across Europe, is the question of immigration. At the core of the question of immigration, when you talk about rights and values, is, as you said, what is the value of human life and what are the rights that an individual has? At the core of the concept of citizenship is that he is a citizen and you are not my fellow citizen. I have more responsibilities to that individual over there than I do to you because of the state. The state is not universal, and therefore the imbalance, I think, of human rights discourse is that perhaps embedded in it is the idea, if universal values and universal rights exist in such a way, that there's something unjust in the state because it makes this distinction between citizens and non-citizens. The idea of that is politically very problematic to say the least, because ultimately what politics is in any polity is what kind of protections do your citizens have against a nasty, brutal world? Resources are limited, they're not unlimited, and how are they apportioned? And if you start playing hypocritically with those questions, you are courting all sorts of resentment and disaster, which I think has been building up. And I think we're seeing it now bear fruit in a lot of ways. So is this a question for reimagining human rights? I don't think so on first principles. I think you can still talk about these things. But the politics, you have to mind them in a very important way. And you can't wish away citizenship. You can't wish away the state. I'm not saying you're doing this, but you cannot imagine universal citizenship in the community of man as anything but at the very most limit aspirational and maybe spiritual and religious, but not pragmatic.
We become in Ukraine so pragmatic because you know what, like my answer I had these debates about migration many years in Europe. We are the country from where people were living, and then you discuss social welfare state in Europe. You can also understand like you don't have really that many of that policies in the US. People work hard here. They are not really, like receiving for free a lot of things. You don't have that in this country, especially if you're immigrant. For us today, it's very clear. You need to have people. We are in the country where we have millions of refugees, but the country is still there, and you clearly understand that, in fact, your biggest asset is having people with legs and hands and, arms who can work, because if you don't have people, that's really, ruins your economy, ruin your capability to defend itself. But in fact, it's very strange, but I started to envy the country with a lot of people. I, in fact, understand that the smaller country, it's problematic. I'm talking to my colleagues from Moldova, and they would really say because of what happened, because of the economic crisis they have, because Moldova was dependent absolutely on the port of Odessa, which kind of technically blocked. So there is a huge issue with the economy in Moldova. There are a lot of security risks. So people are leaving, and the editor would tell me that look, Natalia, you come to the university class and it's half empty. There are no teachers, there are no people. And because it's a smaller country than Ukraine, you really understand how devastating just can be. We still, have some millions. So, so I really understand that there could be probably in our ways a very different idea of rethinking migration in our very, very clear-cut case.
Yeah, except, right? I mean, it's interesting. Yes, and still, you have these tribalisms that pop up.
Oh, it is there. But
it's very difficult to get rid of. Tribalism, racism, however you want to put it.
And, I'm not sure now Ukrainians wants to have more people, but if that people would be of a different color, of a different race, it would come from the continent, that would be complicated, even though we all know we just need any people, anybody.
And this is why, anecdotally, and I've seen it, is Poland is doing very well. Lots of Ukrainians there, and they have workers. They don't have worker shortages, no problems. And just to your point about that, small country, Moldova is very small. Croatia is very small. We're losing people all the time. And the really interesting thing is that now in the streets of Zagreb, which you've never seen before, there are not Asian tourists, but I think Filipino and other people are showing up. And their families, they're coming. There haven't been any real cases of, I think, tensions or anything like that. But it's new for a very homogenous country, very small homogenous country. It's striking. You notice it. You notice it in ways it just was not there 3-5 years ago. It's changing. Also, heartening, perhaps. Again, maybe naively optimistic because it's early times. But you will encounter Filipinos working in stores, pretty decent Croatian, they're clearly working hard. They've decided to make a go at it here. Maybe they're sending money back home to families, but they've learned the language and they're trying to make it work. From an economic standpoint, all true. But again, I think Poland is a very good counterexample because it's not like Ukrainians are completely, they know when they have Ukrainian workers, but it's much more acceptable and has been politically much more acceptable for them to have Ukrainians there rather than anyone from Afghanistan or anything like that.
I probably will finalize with something totally different. Like, forget about Trump. Wherever he's saying he dominated the discussion, I'm asking this question not because of Trump and trying to understand the foreign policy. You've been to Ukraine quite a few times. It's not like, like you've been engaged to all this discussion about Eastern Europe, Russia, the US for many, many, many years as editor. So, the place. What are you looking at? What is for you in this war? Also, like somebody who came from Croatia to the US, it may be parallel, it mustn't be. You can have your own reason to, I'm not asking anybody care about Ukraine, but I'm speaking more mentally, to understand, to look, you follow, you have friends. It's not a faraway place.
I've told you this personally off this conversation before. Personally, it was very disappointing that Croatia's president a while ago, probably still doing it to a certain extent, was demagoguing Croatia's own contributions to the effort, and basically parroting the standard fare for a lot of the populists in Europe that end up doing this. Call it Russian talking points or whatever you will, but it's just sort of popular demagoguery, I think. And I was saying that it's striking that this had any purchase in a country like Croatia because again, it's a very different war. The scale is absolutely horrific in Ukraine. And the fact that your aggressor has nuclear weapons changes the calculus profoundly and makes it, on a completely different scale. But nevertheless, I think for Croats who remember our war, it's very difficult not to see yourself in the position of Ukraine. We were a lot luckier. It's, again, small, different because it's splintered in many different ways. It wasn't just, two countries, one huge one, a smaller one, just getting bullied like this. But there was Western aid involved. And in the end, basically, it worked out for Croatia as well as it could have, all around. Our prime minister, Andrej Plenković, I met him while he was a member of European Parliament. He was just coming through DC, and he was working in the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think, at the Parliament. And he gave a briefing as a European member of Parliament about Ukraine back then, before he was prime minister. It was very impressive. And he, again, you could see the way he spoke about Ukraine as someone who really understood all of this. So, I would say that's a big part of, at least sort of the easy understanding and or empathy for what is happening, the frustration that, the position you find yourselves in. We didn't find ourselves in. There were all sorts of uglinesses of politics in even solving that much smaller conflict, and all sorts of cynicism that was involved there as well. It wasn't just a beautiful fight for anything like that. It was a deeply cynical thing, and all sorts of ugliness still persists. But yeah, that's I think maybe my answer to you. That's the connection.